5 true scary stories from haunted hospitals. Ghostly encounters that will haunt you. Dr. Thomas Crawford had never been one to shy away from the unknown. As a psychiatrist, he prided himself on his logical mind, his ability to dissect the most bizarre cases with an unwavering sense of reason. But as he stood before the decaying gates of Greystone Asylum, a twinge of doubt gnawed at him. This was no ordinary place. It was an abandoned institution, left to rot for over a decade, its once vibrant walls now sagging under the weight of neglect. The place had been shut down abruptly, its doors slammed shut on patients and staff alike, but its history was one that still haunted the town, a history Dr. Crawford was now inexplicably drawn to. It wasn't the allure of a forgotten institution, nor the promise of discovering long-lost medical records that had led him to this place. It was a letter that arrived with no return address, written in ink that looked eerily fresh against the yellowed paper. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight of secrecy that had haunted him ever since. "We need your help. The past is still here. Come find the truth." The letter had no signature, no indication of who sent it, but the invitation was too compelling for Dr. Crawford to ignore. Curiosity gnawed at him, even as caution whispered warnings in his mind. He had to see it for himself. And now, standing in front of the desolate asylum, the cold wind biting at his skin, he felt an unsettling presence in the air. The feeling of being watched, of being expected. With a deep breath, he pushed open the rusted gates and stepped onto the grounds of Greystone Asylum. The building loomed before him, its tall, crumbling structure reaching toward the sky like the skeletal remains of a forgotten era. Dark windows, like empty eyes, stared back at him, and the rustling of dead leaves underfoot sounded unnervingly loud in the silence that enveloped the place. As he walked toward the front door, his footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was alive, watching him. The door creaked open of its own accord as he approached, an unsettling invitation to enter. His heartbeat quickened, but he stepped inside, determined to uncover whatever truths lay hidden within. The air inside was thick with the scent of mold and decay, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and old, forgotten medical equipment. Dr. Crawford's eyes were immediately drawn to the faded patient records scattered across an old wooden desk. He brushed aside the dust, flipping through them with a sense of reverence. The names and faces were a blur, dozens of patients, all with hauntingly familiar conditions. But it was the notes scribbled in the margins of each file that caught his attention. Words like unnatural, unsettling, and abnormal jumped off the page, their meanings unclear but heavy with implication. He moved further into the asylum, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of paper and the faint hum of the wind through the broken windows. As he entered the dark, narrow hallway, something caught the corner of his eye, a shadow, fleeting and indistinct, skittering across the wall. He froze, staring into the darkness, but the hallway was empty. He dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the light, but the feeling remained. Something was watching him. The further he ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the building itself were holding its breath. A chill ran down his spine as he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, just out of reach. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. It was as though the building had a life of its own, its creaking floors and whispering walls alive with the weight of its past. Dr. Crawford shook his head, trying to focus. He wasn't here for supernatural nonsense. He was here to find the truth. But truth, he quickly realized, had a way of hiding in the shadows. The deeper he ventured into Greystone Asylum, the more unsettling things became. The doors seemed to creak open by themselves. A cold wind would gust down the hallways when no windows were open. Shadows flickered, shifting on the edges of his vision. The building seemed to groan, as though it were coming to life. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of movement. Dr. Crawford could feel the oppressive weight of history pressing in on him. And yet, despite the creeping dread, he couldn't stop himself from exploring further. There was something here, something buried beneath the dust and decay, something that called to him. He had come here looking for answers, but what he found instead was the undeniable sense that the asylum was not a place of the past. It was a place of the present, and it was not ready to let go of its secrets. As the day turned to night, the temperature dropped and the shadows deepened. He found himself standing in front of a room marked only by a faded nameplate, Ward 7. This was it, the heart of the asylum, the place where the most troubled, most disturbed patients had been kept. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder as he pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old mildew, and the walls seemed to close in on him. The floor creaked under his feet as he stepped deeper into the room. The room was barren, save for an old, rusted bed frame and a few scattered papers. But it wasn't the room itself that unsettled him. It was the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was waiting for him. It was then that he saw it. On the far wall, written in what appeared to be old blood, "They never left." A chill crawled up his spine. He wasn't alone in this place. Whatever had been here before was still here, lingering in the corners, watching, waiting. Dr. Crawford's pulse quickened as he stumbled backward, suddenly aware that the walls seemed to be closing in on him. The air grew thick, suffocating. The building, it seemed, had begun to breathe. Story 1. Hauntings in abandoned mental asylums. Dr. Thomas Crawford had been at Greystone Asylum for only a few days, yet already the place had begun to feel like a second skin. Every creaking floorboard, every whisper of wind, seemed to draw him deeper into the history of the place, as though the asylum itself was beckoning him to uncover its dark secrets. He had started his investigation by combing through old medical records, but it was a journal, an old, leather-bound book, that truly caught his attention. The journal belonged to Elaine Montgomery, the head nurse of the asylum before its closure. She had written in great detail about her time spent in the hospital, recounting the bizarre, the cruel, and the downright terrifying events that took place within its walls. As Dr. Crawford flipped through the pages, he could feel the oppressive weight of her words. Her writing was filled with frustration, horror, and guilt, the ink almost bleeding off the pages with each passing entry. Elaine's accounts focused mostly on a patient named Jonah, a man who had been admitted to Greystone in the late 1950s. Jonah had been diagnosed with severe delusions, but according to Elaine's journal, his behavior was not due to mental illness. He had been subjected to horrific treatments, electroconvulsive therapy at inhuman levels, restraints for days at a time, and most disturbingly, experiments that blurred the lines between medical science and torture. Jonah's health deteriorated rapidly, and eventually, he died during one of these cruel procedures. But his death was never reported, and the circumstances surrounding it were buried beneath a veil of secrecy. According to Elaine, Jonah's death was not just a tragic accident, but an act of murder, one that would haunt the asylum for years to come. Elaine wrote that Jonah's ghost was restless, angry, and vengeful. She claimed to have seen him multiple times wandering the halls of the asylum after hours, his pale face twisted in anguish, his eyes filled with rage. His presence was felt in every dark corner of the building, a constant reminder of the suffering he had endured. Yet, despite her many attempts, Elaine could never get anyone to believe her. The ghost of Jonah remained a mere whisper, an unconfirmed rumor among the staff. But as Dr. Crawford read on, the journal began to change. The entries became more frantic, desperate. Elaine's own mental state seemed to deteriorate alongside the asylum's walls, as though the more she uncovered, the more she fell under Jonah's influence. Her final entries were disturbing to read, filled with cryptic descriptions of strange occurrences, voices in the night, doors that opened by themselves, and shadows that lurked just out of sight. Elaine wrote that Jonah was no longer just a ghost, but a force, an entity that was hungry for justice. She begged for someone to come forward, someone to expose the truth and release Jonah from his torment. Dr. Crawford closed the journal, the eerie silence of the asylum now settling around him. Despite his rational mind, the weight of Elaine's words lingered. Jonah's spirit was not just a figment of her imagination, was it? As he wandered the asylum's dark, neglected halls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Jonah's vengeful eyes were upon him. urging him to follow the path Elaine had set before him. The first night Dr. Crawford spent in the asylum was the beginning of his descent into madness. As the clock struck midnight, a low whisper filled the room. At first, he thought it was the wind or the house settling, but then the words became clearer. "Help me find the truth." The voice was soft but insistent, coming from somewhere just beyond the shadows. Dr. Crawford's heart raced. He reached for the lamp, but the light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The whispering continued, louder now, guiding him through the dark hallways of the asylum. Following the voice, Dr. Crawford found himself standing in front of a room he had never seen before. The door was ajar, creaking as though inviting him inside. With a deep breath, he stepped over the threshold and into the long-forgotten therapy room. It was here that Dr. Crawford first saw Jonah. The figure appeared out of the darkness, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow with an unimaginable sorrow. Jonah's mouth twisted into a silent scream, and his hands reached out, beckoning Dr. Crawford forward. The psychiatrist froze, unable to move as the air around him thickened. Jonah's presence was overwhelming. His pain, his anger, all pressed down on Dr. Crawford's chest, suffocating him. "Why are you here?" Dr. Crawford whispered, his voice shaking. The words felt wrong, as though they were not his own, but Jonah's. The ghost of Jonah did not speak, but the room itself seemed to answer. Memories flooded Dr. Crawford's mind. Visions of Jonah strapped to a table, convulsing under the strain of treatments far beyond what any human should endure. The experiments had been cruel, aimed at breaking the mind and the body. Jonah had been just one of many who had suffered at the hands of the asylum's doctors, but his spirit, it seemed, had been left to fester in the darkness, waiting for someone to acknowledge the truth. In that moment, Dr. Crawford realized the chilling truth. Jonah had not just died. He had been murdered, his soul ripped from its body by the hands of those who had sworn to heal him. His death was not an accident. It was the culmination of years of torture and neglect. The walls of the therapy room seemed to pulse with Jonah's anger, and as the vision faded, Dr. Crawford stumbled back, gasping for air. He was no longer sure what was real and what was a hallucination. The lines between the living and the dead were blurring, and Jonah's vengeful spirit seemed to be pulling him deeper into the asylum's horrific past. Dr. Crawford's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Was Jonah's spirit truly reaching out? Or had his mind finally cracked under the strain of the asylum's oppressive atmosphere? He didn't know what was worse, the idea that he was losing his sanity, or the horrifying possibility that the spirits of the asylum were indeed real. In his search for answers, Dr. Crawford uncovered a hidden file in the asylum's records, one that had been carefully hidden from the public eye. The file contained graphic details of Jonah's death, the unreported incident that had been swept under the rug to protect the asylum's reputation. The file confirmed everything Elaine had written. Jonah had died during an experiment gone horribly wrong, and the staff had covered it up to avoid scandal. Now, Jonah's spirit had found a way to make his death known. And it wasn't just Jonah. The spirits of all the victims who had died under similar circumstances were still here, trapped in the asylum, seeking justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. Dr. Crawford knew then that his work at the asylum would never be the same. He was no longer just a psychiatrist studying mental illness. He was a man caught in a war between the living and the dead, a war fought in the shadows of an abandoned building that had been built on suffering and deceit. And Jonah's voice, now louder, clearer, continued to echo in his mind, a constant reminder that some spirits never rest. They seek, they haunt, and they demand the truth be told. Story 2. Paranormal activities in operating rooms. Dr. Claire Edwards had always been a woman of logic and precision. As an experienced surgeon at one of the city's most established hospitals, she had seen it all: the blood, the trauma, the life or death decisions. Her career had been built on a foundation of unwavering confidence, a belief that with the right skill and determination, she could save anyone. But as the years went by, something unsettling began to disrupt her perfect world of sterile procedures and calculated risks. The hospital where she worked was old, its infrastructure outdated, its history shadowed by decades of medical advances and missteps. The operating rooms, in particular, seemed to hum with an eerie energy. Claire had always attributed it to the weight of history, the many lives that had been saved or lost within those walls. But lately, the feeling had intensified, becoming more than just a lingering sense of age. Late-night surgeries were when it was most noticeable, when the hospital's usual bustle had quieted down and the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms seemed to grow colder. At first, Claire chalked it up to fatigue or stress. Long hours, difficult procedures, surely that could explain the occasional strange sensation. But as the weeks passed, her skepticism began to waver. It was during a routine surgery on a middle-aged man that Claire first experienced something she couldn't ignore. The patient, a man in his 50s, had been under anesthesia for some time, and the surgery was progressing as expected. Claire focused intently on the incision, her hands steady and sure, when suddenly she felt it, a coldness, deep and unsettling, creeping through the room. Then, without warning, she saw an invisible hand press down on the patient's chest, hard, as if trying to force the breath from his lungs. The man's chest heaved in response, as though someone were gripping him with unseen strength. His vital signs spiked, and his body jerked slightly under the pressure. Claire's heart raced as she snapped her head up, looking around the room, but there was no one else there. Her surgical team was focused on their tasks, unaware of the strange event unfolding. Was that just me? Claire thought, trying to calm herself. Stress. It's just stress. But the incidents did not stop there. Over the following weeks, Claire began to notice similar occurrences. During another late-night surgery, a young woman undergoing a routine appendectomy, the same invisible force seemed to push down on her chest as well. Once again, the patient's vital signs spiked, and Claire felt a strange, oppressive chill in the air. This time, she glanced over at her surgical team, expecting them to have noticed something too. But no one said a word. Stranger still were the reports from her colleagues. Nurses and surgical assistants began complaining about cold spots in the operating room, pockets of icy air that appeared without warning, only to vanish just as quickly. Footsteps echoed through the halls when no one was there. And most disturbingly, several of them mentioned the sensation of being watched, of feeling an unseen presence lurking just behind them, breathing down their necks. At first, Claire dismissed these claims. The hospital was old, after all. Old buildings had quirks. Air ducts made strange noises. But deep down, she could feel the shift, a growing unease that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The more she tried to ignore it, the more persistent the sensations became. One evening, during a particularly difficult operation, Claire found herself alone in the operating room for a brief moment. Her assistant had stepped out to retrieve a new set of surgical tools, and Claire was left standing by the operating table, staring down at the patient as her mind wandered. She absent-mindedly adjusted the lighting above the patient's head when a sudden, sharp gasp escaped from her. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure, a shadow, fleeting and transparent, moving at the edge of the room. It was only a glimpse, but it was enough to freeze her in place. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned sharply, fully expecting to see a nurse or someone from the team. But the room was empty. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. The unsettling visions had become more vivid, and the constant cold spots in the operating rooms were beginning to take their toll on her concentration. Something was deeply wrong. She needed to understand what was happening. Driven by an obsessive need to uncover the truth, she started digging into the hospital's history. What Claire uncovered in the hospital's archives shook her to the core. The operating room where she had performed countless surgeries was not just any room. It was the site of a tragic, unsolved murder decades ago. Dr. Randolph, a former surgeon known for his brilliant yet controversial techniques, had once worked there. According to the old records, he had performed an experimental surgery on a young woman, a procedure that was far beyond the ethical boundaries of medicine. The patient, a woman named Margaret Lawson, had died during the operation. Her body never revived. Dr. Randolph had been suspended for a short time, but there had been no charges, no investigation into the circumstances of her death. The family had never received justice, and the case had been swept under the rug. The details in the old file were chilling. The notes indicated that Dr. Randolph had been obsessed with pushing the boundaries of medical science, even to the point of risking lives. His obsession with perfecting his techniques had led him to perform surgeries that no one else dared to attempt. And it seemed that Margaret Lawson had been his final fatal experiment. As Claire read the account of Margaret's tragic death, she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The room, the very space where she had been working all these years, was tainted by a history of guilt, of a life taken in the name of medical progress. Dr. Randolph had been absolved of any wrongdoing, but the specter of Margaret's death still lingered in the sterile air of the operating room. And it seemed that Margaret's spirit was not at peace. That night, Claire finally had the terrifying encounter that had been building for weeks. As she was performing another surgery, the room grew eerily quiet, the usual background hum of medical equipment stilled as if holding its breath. The temperature dropped sharply, and Claire could see her breath in the air, despite the temperature control system being fully functional. She turned, startled, as she saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a woman, her features blurred and indistinct, but Claire could make out the unmistakable silhouette of a patient's gown. The figure stepped forward slowly, almost gliding across the floor, until she was standing at Claire's side. Claire could feel the presence now. Heavy, oppressive, suffocating. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Claire knew exactly who it was. Margaret Lawson. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, and Claire found herself unable to look away. The woman's face was twisted in agony, her eyes pleading, and as Claire stared into them, she felt a deep sense of guilt and remorse flood over her. The spirit's silent cry for justice echoed in Claire's mind. And in that moment, the surgeon understood the true nature of the haunting. It was not just a presence. It was a call for redemption, for the truth to finally be acknowledged. Claire's hands trembled as she finished the surgery, but she knew that she could no longer deny the truth. Margaret Lawson had never received justice, and Dr. Randolph had never been held accountable. It was time for the truth to come to light, and for the spirits of the past to finally find peace. From that day forward, Dr. Edwards became obsessed with Margaret's case. She pushed the hospital board for an investigation, uncovered more records, and eventually managed to reopen the case. The hospital, once a place of healing, had been a sanctuary for dark secrets, and it was time for those secrets to be revealed. In the end, the truth about Dr. Randolph's unethical surgery and the tragic death of Margaret Lawson came to light. The hospital was forced to acknowledge its past, and Dr. Randolph's name was forever tarnished by his crimes. But for Claire, the haunting presence of Margaret Lawson never fully left her. She could still feel the cold air, still see the shadow of the woman in the corner of her eye. The spirits of the past had been heard, but the weight of their presence would linger, reminding Claire that some sins, no matter how much time passes, could never truly be forgiven. Story 3. Disturbing experiences in burn units. Nathan had always considered himself an experienced and steady nurse. His years of service in the burn unit of the city's most renowned hospital had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, how to provide comfort to those suffering from excruciating pain, and how to navigate the dark and uncertain side of medicine. The burn unit was a place where the hardest cases came for treatment, patients whose lives had been forever changed by the flames. But despite the hospital's state-of-the-art equipment and life-saving procedures, there was something about the place, something unsettling, that Nathan had learned to ignore over the years. It wasn't until the late-night shift started to feel different that Nathan began to question the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. There was something about the old, neglected wing of the burn unit that made him uneasy. It was a part of the building that had been closed off for years, its windows cracked, and its hallways dark and empty. No one ventured into that area anymore, and no one talked about it. But on his late shifts, when the world outside was quiet and the hospital felt like it was holding its breath, Nathan couldn't help but feel that the forgotten wing was watching him. It began with the patients, Some of them were so severely burned that their minds couldn't fully comprehend what was happening to them, but many of them still spoke of strange experiences. Figures in the shadows, faces in the corners of their eyes, whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Nathan, being a man of science, had chalked it up to the trauma of their injuries, the delirium caused by pain and medication. But then, he started hearing the stories from other nurses, stories of seeing things they couldn't explain, too. It was one night during a particularly intense shift that Nathan first saw something for himself. A young woman, Emily, had been admitted after surviving a devastating fire that had consumed her entire apartment building. Her body was covered in third-degree burns, and her face was nearly unrecognizable. She had been brought in barely alive, but after days of treatment, her condition had stabilized. Despite the severity of her injuries, Emily was awake and aware, her green eyes wide with fear as she looked around the room. Nathan was adjusting her foreline when she suddenly reached out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "He was here. The man who saved me. He pulled me from the fire." Nathan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked gently, trying to calm her. "The man," she repeated, her eyes wide with terror. "He was covered in flames, but he wasn't burned. He carried me out, told me to hold on, and then he disappeared. I think I'm supposed to thank him." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories from other patients about similar figures, people who appeared during moments of crisis, only to vanish without a trace. It was common in the burn unit for patients to experience hallucinations due to their trauma, but something about Emily's description was different. Her words felt too real. The following night, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he made his rounds, checking on the patients, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room. Figures that weren't quite right. Figures that disappeared when he turned to look directly at them. He tried to push the thought away, but the next patient, an elderly man named Harold, spoke of seeing the same thing. "I saw him too," Harold murmured weakly, his voice barely audible. "The man in the flames. He was here, just like the others said." Nathan had always prided himself on his ability to stay rational in the face of the most harrowing circumstances. But now, he was beginning to doubt his own senses. Could these patients be hallucinating? Could the stress of their burns and treatments be causing them to see things that weren't really there? Or was there something else going on in this unit? Something that no one could explain? That night, when Nathan returned to the nurse's station, he overheard a conversation that sent a chill down his spine. One of the senior nurses, Ruth, was speaking to a colleague, her voice low and cautious. "You know what they say about that old wing," Ruth was saying. "The one that's been closed off. They say the patients there never really left. They say the fire didn't take them all. Some of them are still here, stuck in the walls, stuck in the floors. And sometimes they try to save the new ones." Nathan's mind raced as he absorbed her words. The old wing, the place no one talked about. Had it really been the site of a terrible fire years ago? Was it possible that the souls of the burn victims were still lingering in the unit, caught between life and death, desperately trying to reach out to those who had suffered the same fate? As he delved deeper into the history of the burn unit, Nathan discovered disturbing details about the fire. It had been a catastrophic event, a blaze that had torn through the hospital's old wing, claiming the lives of several patients who had been unable to escape. The fire had been officially labeled an accident, but whispers among the staff suggested otherwise. Some claimed that the fire had been deliberately set, while others spoke of patients who had died under suspicious circumstances in the aftermath. There were rumors of negligent care, of patients left to suffer, and of staff members who had tried to save them but failed. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of those lost in the fire had been left behind, unable to move on. The more he looked into the history, the more he realized that the burn unit, despite its advancements in medical care, was also haunted by its past. The ghosts of the patients who had died here seemed to be trapped in the very walls of the unit, bound by the trauma of their deaths, reaching out to the living in an attempt to save them, or perhaps to warn them. One evening, while alone in the unit, Nathan had his own encounter with the spirits of the past. As he was checking on the latest burn victim, a man who had suffered severe third-degree burns in a car accident. He noticed something strange. The room had grown unusually cold, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and shift, as if something was moving. His heart began to race, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He turned to leave, but as he did, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. A man covered in flames, his body scorched and blackened, but his face, it was familiar. Nathan froze, unable to move as the figure stepped toward him. The man's eyes were hollow, lifeless, yet filled with an unmistakable sadness. "You didn't save me," the figure whispered in a voice that sounded like crackling fire. "You didn't save us all?" Nathan's blood ran cold as the figure reached out to him, its hand burning with an otherworldly heat. The flames didn't scorch Nathan's skin, but they burned deep into his soul. He gasped for air as the figure's presence overwhelmed him, a powerful wave of guilt and loss crashing over him. Suddenly, the figure was gone. Nathan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had seen the ghosts of the burn victims before. He had heard their stories, but this time, the encounter had been different. This time it felt personal. The figure had spoken to him, to his failure, and that's when it hit him. He hadn't just been witnessing the hauntings of the burn unit. He had been a part of them. Years ago, Nathan had been a rookie nurse working on a night shift when a terrible fire had broken out in the unit. He had been one of the first to respond, rushing into the smoke-filled rooms, trying to save the patients trapped inside. But some had perished. Some had never made it out. He had been unable to save them, and he had carried the guilt of that night ever since. Now, Nathan realized that his own near-death experience during the fire had left him bound to the unit, just as the souls of the patients were. He had survived, but he had never truly escaped the trauma of that night. The spirits of the burn victims had reached out to him because he, too, was part of their tragic past. Nathan was no longer just a nurse in the burn unit. He was a part of its haunted history, a history that would never let him go. The spirits, the shadows, the figures in the flames, they were all calling to him, and there was no escaping their grasp. As he stood there, in the cold, darkened room, Nathan understood the terrible cost of the unit's legacy. The spirits had been waiting for him all along, and now he was bound to them forever. Story 4. Haunted Long-Term Care Wards. Sarah had never imagined that her first job as a nurse would lead her to such an eerie, unsettling place. Fresh out of nursing school, she was eager to make a difference, to care for those who needed it the most. But the long-term care facility she had chosen was no ordinary place. It was one of the oldest in the region, a sprawling, labyrinthine complex with wards that seemed to whisper secrets and stories that the staff only half-jokingly spoke of. It wasn't long before Sarah found herself assigned to the facility's oldest ward, a dimly lit section of the building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and age. The ward was home to a variety of long-term patients, many of whom had no family or visitors. As Sarah began her shifts, she learned quickly that this ward was infamous for its eerie atmosphere. The old walls creaked at night, and the distant sound of machinery often echoed through the hallways like a persistent reminder of the lives within. But what unsettled Sarah the most was the faint sound of children's laughter she started hearing during her late-night rounds. At first, she dismissed it as a part of the facility's aged infrastructure. The walls were old, the pipes rusted, and the creaks and groans of the building could easily be mistaken for something supernatural. Yet the laughter seemed too distinct, too real. It came from nowhere and everywhere, echoing down the long, sterile hallways like a distant memory trying to break free. Sarah tried to ignore it, focusing on her duties, but over time, it became impossible to brush off. One night, she finally decided to investigate, thinking perhaps the laughter might be coming from one of the patients. She ventured down the long, shadowy corridor, her footsteps echoing as she passed the rooms of the elderly residents. Most of them were asleep, their rooms dark except for the soft glow of the night lights. But as Sarah approached a room at the far end of the ward, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of children giggling. The sound was coming from inside room 6, a room she had passed countless times. Inside was Mrs. Delaney, a frail, elderly woman who had been at the facility for years. She rarely spoke, but Sarah had grown fond of her quiet presence. As Sarah gently knocked on the door and entered, she was startled to find Mrs. Delaney sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, staring at the empty corner of the room. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "They're playing again." "Who, Mrs. Delaney?" Sarah asked softly, her heart racing. "Who's playing?" "The children," Mrs. Delaney replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've come back. They never leave. They're always here." The laughter grew louder, as though answering Mrs. Delaney's words. Sarah's skin prickled with unease. She couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. The faint giggles seemed to be coming from the shadows, from the very air around her. And no matter how much she tried to reassure Mrs. Delaney, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone in the room. Over the following days, Sarah began to notice other patients behaving strangely. Some would mutter to themselves, their eyes unfocused as they stared into the corners of their rooms. Others would laugh softly, like they were sharing a joke with someone invisible. It wasn't just Mrs. Delaney. Several residents claimed to see the children, though none of them could describe them clearly. It was always the same vague, unhelpful description. Children. Laughing. Playing. Not real, but here. Despite her growing discomfort, Sarah remained skeptical. She chalked it up to the patients' advanced ages, the isolation of the ward, and the peculiarities of their minds as they aged. But the more she witnessed, the more unsettling it became. She decided to investigate further. Sarah began talking to the facility's longtime staff, hoping to find some clue as to why so many of the patients seemed to be hallucinating the same thing. What she discovered shook her to her core. Years ago, a tragic fire had swept through the facility, taking the lives of several children who were being cared for in a separate wing of the building. The fire had been sudden and devastating, and while the cause had been officially ruled as an accident, rumors had long circulated about the facility's negligence. The children, who had been unable to escape the flames, had been forgotten in the chaos of the aftermath. Many of them had been orphans, without families to mourn them. The hospital staff at the time had been overwhelmed, and in the rush to clean up the scene and move forward, the tragic deaths of these children had been swept under the rug. Sarah's research into the fire uncovered something else, a list of names, children who had died in the blaze, but whose records had been strangely altered. Their deaths were not just a tragedy, they were a cover-up. The facility's owners had downplayed the fire to avoid bad press and legal action. The children, it seemed, had been victims of negligence, left in rooms without proper fire safety measures, and many of them had died slow, agonizing deaths. As Sarah pieced together the horrifying truth, she began to suspect that the children's spirits, the ones that her patients had been seeing, had never truly left the facility. It was as though their souls were trapped, unable to find peace, forever bound to the place of their untimely deaths. The laughter that Sarah had been hearing, it wasn't just the result of old pipes or a creaky building. It was the sound of the children who had perished in that fire, still mourning their loss, still seeking attention, still trying to communicate with the living. One night, as Sarah sat alone in the ward's nurse's station, the laughter returned. This time, it was louder than ever before. It filled the entire building, echoing through the walls and rattling the windows. Sarah stood up, heart pounding, and followed the sound, her footsteps quick and urgent. The laughter led her to room 4, a room she hadn't visited in days. Inside, a patient named Mrs. Patterson was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah," Mrs. Patterson gasped, her voice trembling. "They're here. I saw them. They're calling for you." Before Sarah could respond, she felt a chill creep up her spine. The air around her grew cold, and the unmistakable laughter of children filled her ears. She turned toward the corner of the room, and for the first time, she saw them. Figures of children, their faces pale and transparent, were standing in the shadows, their eyes locked on her with a mix of sadness and longing. One of them, a little girl with curly hair and a red dress, stepped forward, her small, ghostly hand reaching out toward Sarah. "Help us," the child whispered, her voice a faint echo. "We're still here. We never left." Suddenly, the laughter stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the child, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The truth hit her like a wave. These children, their spirits, were still trapped in this ward, and they were trying to reach out for help. But what could Sarah do? How could she help them find peace after so many years? As Sarah stood frozen in the room, the ghostly child's hand slipped into hers, and she felt a jolt of energy course through her body. In that moment, Sarah understood the children were not just victims. They were part of something much bigger. Their deaths had been part of a cover-up, and now their spirits had come to her, to the one person who could uncover the truth and put their souls to rest. Determined to find the truth, Sarah began investigating more aggressively, searching for evidence that could prove the fire had been no accident, that it had been caused by the negligence of the facility's owners. As she dug deeper, she discovered files that had been intentionally hidden, documents that spoke of faulty wiring, lack of proper fire escapes, and witnesses who had been silenced. The fire had been set in motion long before the flames ever ignited, and the children had died as a result of sheer corporate indifference. The truth was darker than Sarah could have ever imagined. The spirits of the children weren't just trying to communicate, they were begging for justice, and it was up to her to give it to them. With newfound determination, Sarah began to prepare for the difficult task ahead. The children had given her the clues she needed, and she would not stop until their story was told, and their souls were finally set free. But as she walked out of room 4 that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the children's laughter would haunt her forever until justice was served. Story 5. Spirits in Hospital Waiting Rooms. James had always dreaded hospital visits. The sterile smell, the cold chairs, the endless ticking of the clock. All of it made him feel like time slowed to a crawl. Today, he was at the hospital for a routine procedure, a simple checkup that he didn't expect to be anything out of the ordinary. But as he entered the waiting room, something felt different. It was quieter than usual, almost unnervingly silent. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the air seemed still, too still. He took a seat, scanning the room. The waiting area, which typically had a few people, seemed almost empty. There were only a few others scattered about. A woman flipping through a magazine, a man scrolling through his phone, and a couple sitting together in the corner, their heads bent low in quiet conversation. Their faces were drawn, eyes distant. James tried to settle in, but the silence was overwhelming. His gaze shifted to the clock on the wall. It was already an hour past his scheduled appointment, and yet there was no sign of the nurse or doctor. It wasn't unusual for hospitals to run behind, but the longer James sat there, the more uncomfortable he became. Something about the waiting room felt off. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. As the minutes dragged on, James noticed something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A man, sitting by the window, had been there when James first entered. But now, as James glanced over at him, he could have sworn the man wasn't there at all. In fact, he didn't remember seeing him get up or move. Confused, James rubbed his eyes. Had he imagined it? He turned his head to look around the room more carefully. That's when he noticed something else. The woman flipping through her magazine didn't seem quite right. Her fingers moved, turning the pages, but her face was frozen in a peculiar expression, almost like she was in a trance. And the couple, who had been talking so softly, now seemed motionless, as if frozen in time. James tried to dismiss the unease growing in his chest, telling himself it was just nerves or fatigue. But the more he looked around, the more he realized something was terribly wrong. The woman with the magazine wasn't just sitting still. She was unblinking, her eyes staring into space, like a mannequin caught in an eternal pose. The man by the window? His face was too pale, his features blurred at the edges like an old photograph. And the couple, were they even breathing? Suddenly, the air in the room grew heavier. James felt a coldness creeping up his spine, a presence that wasn't physically there, but could still be felt. He glanced at the clock again. 2 hours had passed, and still, no one had come to call his name. Panic began to rise in his chest as he stood up to approach the front desk. But as he did, his eyes flicked back toward the corner of the room where the woman with the magazine had been sitting. She was no longer holding a magazine. Instead, she was staring directly at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. A chill ran through him, and his heart skipped a beat. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. He couldn't look away. It was like she was trying to say something, her mouth working in slow, deliberate movements. "Help us," he heard her voice in his mind, a soft, distant whisper. "We never left." James stumbled backward, his pulse racing. Was he losing his mind? He blinked hard, rubbed his eyes, but the woman's figure didn't change. In fact, it began to distort. The edges of her body grew hazy, and the quiet ticking of the clock grew louder in his ears as though mocking him. The more he focused on her, the more he could feel an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from her figure. Unable to breathe, James slowly turned toward the door, trying to steady his breath, to shake off the sensation that something otherworldly had gripped the room. He was only a few steps from the exit when a voice from behind him stopped him cold. "Are you going somewhere?" James froze. The voice was soft, childlike, but there was something in it, something that struck a deep chord of fear in him. He turned around, his heart hammering. Behind him stood a young girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, her long hair disheveled and her clothes torn. She looked at him with sad, hollow eyes, her lips curled slightly into a frown. "You shouldn't leave," she whispered. "You're not supposed to leave yet." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The air thickened, and the silence became unbearable. James couldn't look away from the girl. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but all he could feel was a profound, deep sorrow that seemed to come from every corner of the room. The girl stepped closer, her tiny hand reaching out to him, and he instinctively recoiled, his fear growing stronger. "You don't belong here," she continued, her voice growing faint, almost like a fading echo. "None of us do. We're all waiting." James' breath quickened. The other patients, the ones he had thought were just waiting for their procedures, were now staring at him, their faces twisted in despair. He realized then, the man by the window, the woman with the magazine, the couple in the corner, they weren't alive. They were ghosts, just like the little girl. They were all waiting, stuck in limbo, bound to this place by unfinished business, by lives cut short before their time. Each spirit had their own tale to tell, moments they couldn't leave behind. And somehow, in this eerie, silent waiting room, James had become one of them. The hospital, he realized, was not just a place for the living. It was a place where lost souls came to rest, to wait for something they could not understand. One by one, the spirits began to speak to him. The man by the window spoke of his death in a car crash, the woman with the magazine of her untimely cancer diagnosis, and the couple of their sudden, tragic deaths in a house fire. Each of them had died while waiting for something they had never gotten a chance to finish. In a daze, James found himself sitting back down, his hands trembling as he tried to process everything. He spoke to the spirits, trying to offer comfort, but their stories were endless, their need to be heard unyielding. Each one lingered, not in peace, but in a state of longing, unable to move on. And as James listened, the line between the living and the dead began to blur. It was then that the full weight of the hospital's curse became clear. The waiting room, a place meant for the living to prepare for their procedures, was a portal, a place where unresolved deaths, regrets, and unfinished business gathered, unable to find closure. It wasn't just the living who waited in the room. The dead did too. And they would never leave until their stories were told, their lives were acknowledged. James realized that he was now part of this place. He was no longer just a patient waiting for a procedure. He was another soul trapped in the waiting room, with his own unfinished business to reckon with. The spirits gathered around him, their eyes filled with sorrow and plea. He knew what he had to do. He had to make a choice. He could leave, go back to his life, and continue his existence without ever acknowledging what had happened in that room. Or he could stay, help the spirits find peace, and ensure that their voices were heard. But James also knew that the more he stayed, the more he became entangled in the waiting room's curse. The choice was not simple, and the consequences of either decision would be permanent. In the stillness of the room, with the faint hum of the hospital surrounding him, James faced the hardest decision of his life. Would he leave and live, or would he stay and help the lost souls find their way to the other side? The waiting room was waiting for him to decide. Dr. Crawford had spent months researching and investigating the eerie and inexplicable phenomena that haunted the various medical facilities he had visited. Each location, each ghostly encounter, had left a mark on him, deepening his understanding of the human psyche and the lingering forces that defy explanation. Now, sitting alone in the quiet, dimly lit room of the abandoned asylum, he couldn't help but reflect on the horrors he had witnessed. The spirits he had encountered weren't just manifestations of unfinished business, as many believed. They were echoes of suffering, victims of violence, neglect, and injustice, trapped in the very walls where their pain had been inflicted. As he examined each of the stories he had gathered, he realized that these souls weren't simply wandering aimlessly. They existed for a reason, each one a reminder to the living of the injustices and horrors that had taken place, often hidden from view. The ghosts weren't just seeking closure, they were seeking recognition. Recognition of the wrongs that had been done to them, of the lives that had been lost in the shadows. In some cases, their deaths had been quick, in others, slow and agonizing. But all of them shared a common thread. They had been forgotten, their stories silenced, their pain ignored. In the years of his career as a psychiatrist, Dr. Crawford had dealt with the human mind, its fears, its desires, its traumas, but nothing had prepared him for the depth of suffering that some souls carried with them even after death. These spirits weren't merely trapped in a cycle of unrest. They were bound by the scars of their experiences, the weight of their lives' injustices. As Dr. Crawford sat there, surrounded by the decaying walls of the asylum, the weight of their stories began to settle into his heart. These weren't just ghost stories. These were real lives that had been cut short by violence, neglect, and cruelty. And it wasn't just the dead who needed to heal. It was the living as well. The living, who often turned a blind eye to the past, ignoring the consequences of their actions or inactions. He could no longer dismiss the idea that the supernatural was merely a figment of imagination or a trick of the mind. No, the spirits he had encountered were not just memories. They were voices, insistent and demanding, reminding the living of their mistakes and the price they had paid. Dr. Crawford's investigation had taken him through hospitals, asylums, and care facilities, all places where patients, once full of life, had either passed away or suffered under unimaginable conditions. Each place seemed to carry with it a distinct energy, an oppressive atmosphere that hung thick in the air. But he realized as he looked back on his experiences that these haunted places were not simply filled with restless spirits. They were living memorials to the suffering that had occurred there. The ghosts, the hauntings, the eerie presences. They were reminders of what had happened, and in many ways, they were the only voices left for those who had been silenced by time, neglect, or even deliberate cover-ups. These spirits didn't just linger because they were trapped. They lingered because they were the ones who had been wronged. Their pain, their suffering, their stories remained untold. And as a result, they were forced to wander the earth, seeking justice, seeking recognition. These locations, so often dismissed as simply haunted or cursed, were more than just places of fear and discomfort. They were places of reckoning. Hospitals, asylums, and nursing homes, buildings meant to care for the sick and the elderly, had become the final resting place for stories that had been forgotten, or worse, deliberately erased. The voices of those who had been mistreated, abused, or ignored were still calling out, and those who remained alive, whether they were hospital staff, patients, or visitors, had to confront the darkness of the past in order to truly heal. Dr. Crawford had come to understand that healing wasn't just about the living moving on, forgetting the past, and moving forward. Healing was about acknowledging the pain and suffering that had been inflicted, about confronting the ghosts of history and allowing the dead to be heard. Only then could both the living and the dead begin to heal, together. For the past was never truly gone. It existed in the present, in the minds of those who remembered, in the hearts of those who felt the echoes of what had happened. Dr. Crawford stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he moved toward the exit. The abandoned asylum, with its crumbling walls and decaying corridors, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The ghosts of its past were everywhere, lingering in the corners, waiting for someone to listen, to acknowledge their pain. He had been one of the lucky ones. He had heard their stories, and now he understood. He left the asylum behind, but he knew that he was forever changed. No longer could he dismiss the voices of the dead as figments of imagination or the result of a weary mind. They were real. They had lives, they had stories, and they deserved to be heard. He understood now that some ghosts were not simply bound to the past. They existed in the present, and their stories needed to be told. It was no longer about just investigating the supernatural or collecting data. It was about giving those who had suffered a voice. It was about confronting the darkness of the world, acknowledging the wrongs, and giving both the living and the dead the chance to heal. As Dr. Crawford walked away from the asylum, he felt a deep sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had helped them in some small way. He had given the forgotten their voice. And in doing so, he had begun to heal himself. But as he glanced back at the asylum one last time, he couldn't help but wonder how many other haunted places were out there, where the suffering still echoed, where the voices of the past still called out to be heard. The answer, he knew, was countless. And as long as there were ghosts whose stories went untold, his work would never truly be finished.